So yeah, today we're going to be building a full stack React and Django application. I'm going to show you how to put both your front end and your back end together into a single application, as we're going to build a Django application that serves our React application. So it's going to be one full stack project. So I want to just show you what I'm starting with here before I launch into this demo. So currently we have two separate projects. News_project, this is the Django project. So inside of it, it's got the news app and the news project, kind of following that naming scheme where you've got the main module with the same name as the project itself. Then I created one app that's going to have most of the actual logic in it. But in setting up for this demo, I've made a couple of changes to my news site backend. So I just want to point this out really quickly. So first of all, so let's look in the settings.py file. I just want to point out that I am using Django REST framework in this demo. So installed apps, we've got REST framework. And then in the views, I'm using Django REST framework to mark these routes as API views. So I'm not sure if we saw this the other day. This comes from, where is it? REST framework.decorators API view. Can I just see some heads nod? Did we see this yesterday or no? Is this new? Okay, totally new. That's cool. So this lecture today is not really about Django REST framework. I'm not going to get deep into it at all, not nearly as deep as what you've seen in the past couple of days. There's really just one feature from Django REST framework that I wanted to use that's going to make our full stack application a little bit easier to build. And that is this API view decorator. You can add it to any of your routes, and that tells Django that this route is not supposed to be a regular view that returns HTML on like a regular browser request, but this route is intended for AJAX, and it's supposed to send and receive JSON. So I'm not going to write any other code using Django REST framework in this demo, but I just want you to know that just adding this here, API view post, this does a couple things. For one thing, it limits this route to only post requests, because logging in, you shouldn't be able to get login. You need to post your data so that it's secure. So this is limiting this route, this view login to only post requests. But also the API view changes some of the default behavior of how the request works. So just setting API view post, Django REST framework actually replaces the request object with its own custom request object, which is very similar to the default native one in Django. But this one is just a little bit different with some slightly different default settings. So, we can send and receive JSON data a little bit more elegantly. We can skip a few steps because DRF is going to correctly assume what we're trying to do. So I'm not going to have to write any more code that worries about this. It's just that the default settings are going to work a little bit more in my favor for the rest of this lecture, since I've used DRF to declare these as API views.
Hey, Raphael, just a quick question with this. Is this decorator able to be used with how we did it or how we saw it yesterday with a class as a view? Or
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Oh, thanks.
I don't use the class-based views as much, but I'm quite sure that you can use these decorators on a class or a function. And definitely please ask questions during this lecture. This one especially, I'm going to show you some things that might seem unusual to you, and certainly some material that you would not find in a common tutorial, because you'll often find tutorials for React or Django, but the way you integrate them together is a little bit more custom. It's not like some off-the-shelf process. Kind of have to figure out what you need.
Yeah, real quick, Rafael, how are we going to be like, what is going to be our like a summary of our method of how we're going to connect React to Django? Is it going to be through the API that's made with the REST framework?
Well, it's definitely through your API. I'm not going to use Django REST framework too much in this lecture, but however you make your API, that's generally the connection between your React app and your Django application. So actually, I think that leads into my next point here, is that the one other thing that I want to change in my server before we actually start integrating the front end with the back end is that instead of rendering a template, my Django application needs to just send the HTML file down, my index.html. So remember, I guess you don't remember because we haven't seen this yet, but I might have mentioned it in the past that for our React application, we're just running it in dev mode, with the dev server, which is supposed to be fast and convenient while you're just learning. But to actually deploy the application and run it in a more like prod-like manner, we need to actually build our React app. And so when you build the React app, what that does is it condenses all of your different JavaScript files into one or two different minified JavaScript files, and the same for your CSS. And then it creates an index.html that requests those JavaScript and CSS files. So at the end of the day, once our React frontend has done its job, we'll be left with a single HTML file. And so I need my Django backend to serve that HTML file. So it's kind of the next hurdle that we're going to have to overcome in this demo now, is now that Django is able to serve this file, this index.html from inside of static, we need to update React and integrate it with Django so that we can build our React front end and it'll get put in a place where Django is able to serve it. So back to your question, Edgar. This route in Django, send the home page. So this is just, from urls.py, this is my root. Wait, gotta go to the app. So send the home page, that's just my root route. When someone comes to the base URL, no path, we will send the home page. And that's just sending an index.html file. So inside of that index.html, there's going to be all of our React scripts that'll load that starts our React application. And that has a whole bunch of functions defined using Axios that send requests back to your Django backend. So that's how they're connected.
In your URLs, what were those other paths? Because wouldn't you just need that static index? Yeah, why do we need a sign up login path as well?
Right. So I think you brought up a really good point. Like I just said that the homepage is the entire application. What are these other routes for? So this top route, this is the only route in our application that responds with HTML. Everything else here is just part of our API. These routes just send and receive JSON data. So this is not actually the sign up page or the login page that the user can sit on and look at the forms. These are just for the post requests for the user to sign up and log in. So it's a little bit different from how we did things in the past, because I had like a login view that on a get request would serve the login page, and on a post request logged you in. We don't do that now because all the login, sign up, all the pages are included in that main homepage. Like that's our whole app. It loads all the other front end pages. Sound good?
Yeah, it sounds good. Could you make it to where you make sign up login their own like templates, and then like sort of have it to where you do serve the HTML for sign up, but then once they're done signing up, you redirect them to that send the home page? Yeah,
that's certainly a flow that you can do. And I think I mentioned in the past actually that I kind of like that flow for certain applications, using server rendered pages for login and sign up. And then once a user is authenticated, then you send them the single page application so that your React SPA can just assume the user is logged in on every page. Otherwise, it'll just redirect them to the sign up or login page.
Okay. Okay, yeah, that answers it. Thank you.
Cool. Andrew?
Just making sure. So you're saying theoretically, like everything we're linking to is really one page and in its entirety.
Can you restate that?
Almost like it's just like one URL path, and anything that's like connected, like the sign up, login, logout, who am I, are just like extensions of that original page.
Pretty much, yeah.
I think is it like due to like the way how like React works? Because I think I was reading something about React Router, and it's just like it's a way of like kind of faking it out, and like you're actually still on the same page when you're like moving to like different things.
Yeah,
you just don't know it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know it, but yeah, you are on the same page. Like as far as your server is concerned, you only sent one request to the server requesting HTML. That's, you know, your entire React application. And after that, you're just sending requests for JSON, just little bits of data to update that same page that you're on. But yeah, the fact that the URL changes, that's just React Router kind of hacking our URL bar to let the user know what the state of the application is. But the server doesn't know about that. So that's what I was saying the other day when we were talking about React Router. When the URL changes after the hash, that does not trigger a request back to your server. So as you're routing around in React with the client-side routing, and it's only changing after the hash, your server doesn't know or care that you're changing the path like that. Of course, oftentimes when you change the front-end component to a different page, you're going to have a use effect that sends a request to the server. So in that sense, like you are still sending a request to the server when you change pages, but you're not getting like the full HTML.
Okay. Sorry if this slows down the class too much, but I do have another question regarding that. Could you make it to where the backend does care? Like, could you send a request and then that request sort of routes to a different React app? Like a second, like a send to homepage is like a single page React app. Could you make it to where based on like say like if you click this link, then it will send you to a different React app, like a different React page?
Yeah, you could do that. I don't think I've ever felt the need for that level of organization, but you certainly could. I guess as a metaphor, I'm kind of thinking of like Django apps. Like for our Django projects, we've only put one app in them because we just haven't built big enough projects that it would warrant organizing them into multiple apps. But I feel like that's kind of analogous. Like if your front end is so big and complicated and you have like two largely unrelated sections of your front end, like you might develop those with separate teams building entirely separate applications, and you just have two different routes that serve two different spas for the different sections of your site. So that would work.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And just heads up, I'm totally prepared for the possibility that we're not going to get through this lecture this morning, that we'll have to resume this afternoon because there's a lot of content. And I think this is probably one of the best times to ask questions. You're going to see a lot of weird stuff that's probably not covered in common tutorials. And just general like full stack mindset workflow, I feel like is not something that people talk about a lot in like Medium blogs or whatever. So don't feel bad about holding up the class with questions. I am definitely hoping that you'll ask lots of questions. All right, so anyways, we've got our, where's the news app, views. So we're sending the home page. I think you saw before we can open files with Python. So this is not any like special Django magic or whatever. I'm literally just opening a text file on my machine, calling the read method. So this just gives me a string of just all the contents of this file. And then we're sending it an HTTP response. So let's just see real quick what that actually looks like. It's not going to be very impressive at all, I promise you, because this is the index.html in the static folder. But still, let's just run the backend, make sure this actually works. Okay, so I've already got it up and running here. Should be on port 8000. So this is that. Okay, so the Django backend is up and running. It'll serve whatever file is in that index HTML in the static folder. Kat?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I'm just wondering, like, with the way that we kind of learned to do things yesterday with, you know, like local 8000 taking us to like our API page, will we then have to create like a index file to make what you're doing today possible? Or does that page kind of serve as that?
I'm not sure if I understand you. Can you say it again?
Like if I go to, you know, the way that I set up my news API yesterday, like going to local 8000 takes me to like the API route. So I'm just wondering, like trying to make the connection from yesterday to today, does that serve as like, is that kind of the same as what you have at index HTML, or in order to do what you're doing today, will I have to like create an index HTML? If that makes sense.
React will have to create an index.html for you. I'll show you in a moment how we generate that file.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So let's see. So let me just look at the JavaScript app. So the React app is also running. Should look pretty familiar. But this is, you know, just a purely front-end application. It's not at all connected to my Django backend. Okay, so I'm going to take both of these down. I'm going to have to do a little command line wizardry here. So I don't like that we've got these two separate folders, these two separate projects. It should be just one project that we, you know, version in GitHub, for example. You don't want to have your front end and your back end with different versions in GitHub. Then you have the additional hassle of like keeping them in sync with each other, knowing which version of your front end works with which version of your back end. Not doing that. It's one full stack application. Every version of the application is internally consistent with itself. And so I would like them in the same folder so I can look at them all in one view. So we're gonna just move the contents of the news site. This is my front end. We're gonna move that inside of the news project. Because the news project is the Django application. So we're gonna MV news site /star to news project. So this is just going to copy over all of the React stuff into our Django project folder. So we've just got one full stack project folder.
Raphael, why did you do -star?
This gets me not the news site folder itself, but just everything that's inside of it. So stars for everything.
I thought you had to do recursive when moving folders that had items in it.
I don't think you need the recursive flag for MV, or at least because I specified all the individual contents of it. It shouldn't be necessary. I guess we'll find out. So it looks like everything got copied over, but things did not get deleted from the news site project. I think that should be fine though. Maybe just need to be more careful with some of my folder names here. But so now I'm going to go into the news site project. So now we'll notice that we've got all of the files and folders from our Django project as well as our React project. It might be a little bit tricky to keep them separated and know what's what, but at the very least, like all of your front end code is .js files, all of your back end code is .py files. So hopefully you'll be able to keep track of what's what.
And Rafael, I don't really remember. Did we create an app at all, or we never created an app in because how you do like manage.py create app?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that would have been done previously as I'm kind of building off my news app backend. So here's the news project. That's the top level project folder. Inside here's the main Django module for the news project. And then I did previously run a start app to create the news app. So this is going to have most of the actual backend logic, whereas news project really just has the settings.py file.
Okay, so we have three main parts where it's like the news project, the news app, and then where's so there's no folder for the front end. The front end is just like everywhere else.
There's a couple loose folders.
Static.
Okay. SRC is for the front end, but so this is where things are going to get a little complicated. Is that both Django and React care about your static folder? So it needs to be in a place where both of them can see it.
So you can't create like a directory that says like front end, and then that's at the same level as news app and news project.
You could potentially. Part of the problem that we're having here is because we're using create React app. That does make things a lot simpler for us. We don't have to configure anything to get going, but it also means that we can't configure things. So like create React app has a very specific Webpack configuration that looks for certain files in certain directories and will output them to certain other directories. And it's not very flexible about that unless we want to eject from create React app. That's this script that gets rid of all of the scaffolds and hand holding that create React app gives you and leaves you to configure Webpack on your own. So in theory, you should be able to configure Webpack to just work with any arbitrary folder structure that you want. But in the interest of doing as little configuration as possible and relying on the defaults on create React app, this is a workflow that I found that seems simple enough.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do we have another hand up?
Yeah, so just some tracking. So the news project now has all the Django stuff and the React stuff, right?
Yeah, this top level news project.
Right. Yeah, the top level. So that news site on the bottom, we're not messing with that at all right now anymore, I guess. Yeah, cool.
Nope.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so now let's go. I'm gonna run the server. So I haven't changed, how the application runs. I've just kind of changed the folder structure a little bit, but everything is still connected successfully, correctly. So we're still able to serve that index.html through our Django application. But of course, I don't want to serve just this dumb index.html file. I want to serve the React index.html file. So let me show you real quick how we get that. So I'm just opening another terminal here inside my news project. Now, if we looked at the package.json, we get a few scripts included when we create a React app. So today we're going to be using the build script. So this will take maybe 5 or 6 seconds. So just for the record, this might seem a little bit sluggish, but there, it's done already. And you're gonna see me build this a few times today, but I just want to assure you that like when you're actually working on a real professional project, most of your time is spent reading code, like thinking, planning, debugging, talking with your colleagues or whatever. Very little time, relatively little time is spent actually like writing and running code compared to like thinking about the problem. So like you're not going to actually be compiling and recompiling the application quite as frequently as you're going to see me do today. But also I mentioned in the past that there are other compilers you can use for React apps. So if you really find that this is just intolerably slow, you can consider using Vite, which I know I've showed you before. Yeah, so this is just the homepage for Vite where they're bragging about how much faster it is than Create React App. So it's probably pretty good. But for today, we're just gonna be sticking with the defaults. But anyways, so I've built the application. So after I run build, that's gonna create a new folder for me. Creates this build folder. So I wanna take just a second for us to understand the structure of this build folder. It's not complicated, but we have to know how this works. This is another kind of awkward problem that we're going to have to deal with today, is that like this build folder is for your static files, your HTML, your JavaScript, etc. And both React and Django have opinions about how your static files should be handled. Unfortunately, React is very unflexible about this. So we're going to have to configure Django to look for static files in the place where React is going to put them anyway. Because like I said, I don't want to eject from Create React App. I don't want to configure Webpack. I'm just going to rely on the default settings and try to get Django to work around that because it's easier to configure Django at this point. So the specific contents of this build folder. So first at the top level in the build folder, it's just whatever you put in public gets copied over there. So this is where you would put like uncompiled resources, like if you have images or music, stuff like that, you put in the public folder and then it just gets copied over into static. And this is the folder that is actually accessible to the client when they're requesting resources or whatever. Inside of build, there's this static folder, and this has your compiled assets. So your JS, this is just one minified JavaScript file that includes all of the like different JSX, the different JavaScript files that you wrote just in one big JavaScript file. And then there's like some kind of map file. This is like related to it, but it's not the main JavaScript file. But for the most part, like this condenses all of your JavaScript into one file. Similarly for your CSS, this is most of the CSS from my website just in one minified file. So what I need to do now is reconfigure Django so that when users like request scripts and style sheets, it's served from this static folder instead of this static folder. So I'm going to be deleting this folder in just a second. Edgar?
Yes, I was gonna ask, is there any way to, after you build it, how would you like make changes to React? Like say like you want to change something.
That is a really good question. And that's the next thing that we're going to talk about after I get the static files set up here. So that's cool that you're thinking ahead.
I'll wait.
Yeah, get excited. Okay, so another thing that I want to point out that, again, we cannot change easily is in this generated index.html file, that we get when we run npm run build, you'll notice that this already has script and link tags in it. So React, when it builds our index.html, it is assuming that it can access the JavaScript files that it built. It's assuming that it can access the JavaScript files that it built with this URL /static/js. So it's not easy to configure that. This is just what comes out when I run npm run build. And so instead of trying to configure React to look for the static files where Django is already providing them, I'm just going to reconfigure Django so that it serves the static files from the place where React is already requesting them. So first of all, I'm going to go to my views. So this part of the problem is actually going to be even easier because we don't actually care about the static middleware yet. I'm just going to hard code in a different path for the index.html. So I know that this is how React is going to generate its output. It's going to give me this build folder. And then inside of build, there's an index.html. So we want to read that, send it to the client. So let me see if that actually does what I think it does. Okay, so that did work. I did get the main document. You know, this is my minified index.html that React generated. So that's cool. That part worked. But these requests failed for the CSS and the JavaScript because my static middleware is not set up yet. So I've got to do that so we can actually get our CSS and JavaScript so that the app loads properly. Andrew?
So just make sure, like, to understand what we're doing right now, if you go back to the index.html file and look at the source files, the real issue is it's like looking at static and then it's trying to look for a folder that has JS underneath it. But when we do build, it doesn't have that JS folder, right? That's just a React thing from the past.
Build does have the JS inside of it. Mm-hmm. So it's build static CSS JS.
Okay. So it is there. I thought it wasn't there.
Yeah. The problem, I guess the simple way I can describe the problem with this folder structure is that I want to have static/CSS and static/JS, but instead I have build/static/CSS and build/static/JS. So there's this extra layer in the way, which is not what Django is expecting.
Okay, thank you.
So to get this to work as is, I would have to write like /static/static, because just saying static in the URL gets me the build folder. And so if I want to get the static folder inside of it, I would write my URLs like this, which requires extra configuration and looks dumb anyway, so I'm not going to do that. So that's the URL as it is generated by React. Now I'm going to go to my settings.py and tell Django where it should be serving these static files from. Where did I put you? So I need to change these static files dirs. So instead of static, I told you the problem is now we have this extra folder in front of it. We're going to serve static files from build/static. So this kind of request for /static and then /JS or /CSS, that's automatically going to be looking inside of /build/static. So whatever comes after that in URL can access these folders, CSS or JS. And then of course the files inside of them. So now if I refresh the page, come on, there we go, awesome. It's It's exactly what I was hoping. I'm gonna actually do this in incognito so we don't get the cookies causing any issues. Yeah, okay. So here is my full stack React and Django application where I have built my backend using React, the npm run build, and React is automatically putting it into this build folder because that's just what React does. But now Django knows that this is where our front end assets are. So Django is prepared to serve these static file requests from the folder that React created. Andrew, you have a question?
Yeah, so from now on, we should be using like all the static stuff should be served up and built by us on the front end in React and not like the old method of like having a static file in Django, right?
Say that one more time.
Like, because before, like we could have made like Django and we could have like had the static folder and used the folders and that like use like the things inside that static folder. But now we're just gonna serve up like all the stuff by like within our React app first and move it over to Django.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say this is kind of similar, honestly, to what I was doing before, where we had this top level static folder that Django was serving. Except before, we would have manually put files into the static folder. Whereas now the build folder is serving as our static folder and React is generating this automatically. So it's pretty similar. I'd say that this is quite different though from the sort of Django recommended workflow where each of your apps has their own static folder. Because then when you go to deploy the application, or if you just want to run it in a more production-like manner, you have to copy all of the static folders from all of your individual apps into this top-level static folder. So I figured we would just skip a step and just kind of build our Django app in a way that is a little bit more close to how it's going to look at the end anyway. And also just more close to how I would like it to be to have it integrate with React more elegantly. Just in general, Django provides you a lot of functionality for managing static files. Some of it is very useful. Some of it I don't understand, like why people would want to do things like that. So you can kind of pick and choose the tools that are useful to you. So yeah, I'm not using the like app level static file management. I've just got this one top level static files folder. And Django knows to serve files from that folder because of this setting in my settings.py file. Sound good?
Yeah, it helps. It's kind of like, it's almost like better to like keep them like fully separated now. Like React is front end, Django is back end, and we move them together instead of like having this weird like mixing of everything at once.
They're certainly much more separate now.
Yep.
Yeah, Django is like pretty hands-off by your static files. It's really just the API layer. And it's that first request to send the index HTML that kicks off the whole React app. All right. So we've got this app. It seems like it's working. We can serve our static files. So let's try to do some development. I'm going to make some changes here. Let's say I'm just so dang excited about this page. I'm going to add an exclamation mark after that home. I'm going to go to source. Where did I put you? Components, app nav, home. I really love going home. I'm going to put an exclamation mark there. Now, if I reload the page, we're not going to see this because we have not rebuilt the application. So yeah, this is kind of dumb. I usually don't recommend looking through minified files, but I just did a quick search through the minified JavaScript. And here I can see home, which is supposed to appear in the nav bar, but it doesn't have the exclamation mark. this has not been updated. So I could just run build again, npm run build, and that'll give me the next updated version of the application. But that is just really inefficient. Like, you don't want to be running this command every time you save your work. You don't want to risk like making mistakes because you forget to run the build command, and then you're actually working on the previous version of the application, not knowing it wasn't updated, and then like things aren't working, you don't know why, you go crazy about it. So it would be really great if this updated automatically for us. There were 2 hands that I saw.
Yeah, you pretty much answered my question. I was going to ask why you're serving a production build rather than just running a dev server. I think you're going over it right now.
Mm-hmm. There's a few reasons for that. Generally speaking, I want the front end to be served by the back end. I don't really like the React dev server, especially with like the hot reloading, where it like you can change your components and then it like updates the front end without actually sending a new request to your back end. It doesn't actually like start over from the beginning. So I've seen a lot of situations where like using the dev server, you can actually get into like illogical or impossible states that your application couldn't normally like do. So, I prefer to just recompile, use the more production ready build, do a fresh.
I've never had those issues. I only build production before deployment.
Yeah, and also this way we don't have to mess around with cores because our backend is going to be serving our front end. It's all one application. So there's a couple of topics dealing with cores, security headers that we don't have to deal with because this is a single full stack application.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Where are we? Okay, so in order to automate the rebuilding of this application, I'm going to install a new library. There's an npm library called watch. So I think I already installed it, but I'll install it again. Why not? Now, what this does is this lets you basically watch files in your project and say, hey, I created a second node modules folder. It'll let you watch files in your project and say, hey, whenever these files change, run this code. So the way we would use this is by adding another script to our package.json. Call this watch. And so we're just going to invoke the watch command, say watch, and then we give it a command to run. And then we give it a folder to watch. So this is saying that if anything inside of /src changes, run this command. So that's going to automate restarting our server for us. So we're not going to have to think about rebuilding it constantly. We just turn on the watcher when we're ready to start developing, and that's going to automatically update our front end as we make changes. And I'm actually going to take this one step further, make it a little better, because I would like to also restart the Django server when we change our front end code. Usually that doesn't matter. Usually you don't need to restart the Django server just because your front end changed. But I've run into a couple situations where that was necessary. So I'm just going to automate that also. So this might look a little bit weird. The thing is that as far as I could tell, Django doesn't actually have a single command to restart the server. But if you change any of your Python files, it does restart the server. So this command is just touching the manage.py, which doesn't actually modify the file, it just updates the timestamp. But that's enough that it'll get Django to restart the server. So this is a pretty simple, lightweight way to get Django to restart itself automatically when we change any of our files. Andrew?
So when you ran npm run build earlier, it took like 5 or 6 seconds. Does it mean that every single time source changes, it's going to lag your computer for 5 or 6 seconds?
I mean, it's not going to lag my computer. I can do other stuff, but it's going to take about 5 seconds to get the new version of the front end.
Will it just like stop the VS Code?
No, I mean, just this terminal would be working, but you can still type.
Okay.
Yeah, if it actually stopped you from typing, that would be intolerable. I would just throw VS Code out. So what are we doing here? So this is where I'm running my Django server. I'm going to start the watcher here.
Hey, Al, can I just ask a quick thing? I feel like
Sure.
I'm like slow processing today, so sorry. But so basically, like everything, I know we didn't talk about it a whole lot yesterday, but like all the CORS header stuff is not relevant to like the way that you set up your project. Is that right?
Right. We're not going to need that today. CORS headers are useful for a different sort of application architecture where your front end is served from a different application than your back end. It comes from a different URL. And so in that case, because your back end, because your front end is not served by the back end, you're going to get security errors if you try to send cross-domain requests. So the server would have to set CORS headers to explicitly say, like, this other website is the front end for our back end. They can send requests to the back end and get responses, and no one else can.
Okay, so just to kind of get a picture of it. So like if you had kept, like if we kept our React app in a separate folder and like kept it on running on like the development server, we would need the CORS headers in that case?
That's right.
Okay, thanks.
And I just don't want to deal with that. If you're building a single full stack application, CORS shouldn't be relevant. It's all, you know, to the same application. And a lot of people I find don't really understand CORS. And so when they like enable those CORS headers, they just disable all security instead of actually like doing the right thing, you know? So instead of like encouraging you to use a technology you don't fully understand and potentially setting up your website in an insecure way, we're kind of building it this way so we don't even have to worry about CORS.
Raphael, in this case, are both the apps running on the same like port, like port 8000 or?
So remember, we only have one app. Nothing's running on port 3000 anymore. Django is running on port 8000. And when I send a request to localhost 8000, it sends me the index.html, which has the whole React app, which sends more API requests back to Django. And then, yeah, Django satisfies them. I guess right now, Django isn't doing much for the front end in terms of an API, but we'll get there later in this demo. What other questions do we have?
Just a really quick one. I think you went over it, but we lost React's hot refresh, right? Or whatever it's called right now.
That's right.
Okay.
I'm going to be honest, I don't really like the hot reload in general. Like how to put this? I mean, it's like a relatively new feature. I've been developing for a while without it and always had a great time. When I started using the hot reload feature, I just kept finding like weird buggy situations and just complicated my development workflow. There would be some just bugs that occur only with the hot reload, only in the dev server, because there are some subtle differences in how it behaves versus how like an actual like real web application that's served from a server will behave. And so at some point I just didn't want to deal with it. Like this is generally like kind of a philosophical approach to developing. I know a lot of developers want to get their local environment set up with all the conveniences and automation and magic possible. So like all they have to do is write code. But I feel like the more you like configure your dev environment like that, the more you introduce subtle differences between your local environment and the production environment. And it just creates more possibilities for, you know, things to work on your local machine when you're developing and then just fail in prod. So I've always had the experience of like being a solo full stack developer and I'm responsible for the entire application. Like there is no QA. If the thing breaks on a weekend, then I get called to fix it. So I generally try to build things in like a simple and reliable way as possible so that like that doesn't happen. And that generally involves developing the application in a way that is as similar as possible to how it's going to run in production so that there are as few surprises as possible when I actually go to deploy it. But that's just kind of my philosophy on building full stack apps. Other people do things differently. All right, so see here, I told you I was going to make some changes. All right, so I'm going to run npm run watch. And as soon as you run it the first time, it does immediately run the command. So it builds your app immediately. You don't have to do that separately. All right, so it's done now. So I update, we see we've got that exclamation mark in there, great. I changed my mind about that though, I don't like it anymore. I'm gonna delete it. I'm gonna go back to the app nav. And then I'm gonna delete it and then just save the file. And you can see immediately that the build script starts up again. I didn't have to run it, it just goes, it does its thing, replaces everything in the build folder with new build folder. See, it takes a minute. We don't even have static yet. And now we've got static in the index HTML. Everything's been replaced. And we get the update on my front end. So at this point, we've got a pretty decent like full stack development workflow going on. The next thing that I'm going to show you is how we can authenticate to our backend using our front end. We should probably take a break before then though. But before we take a break, does anyone have any questions about just the full stack concepts that we've covered so far?
Yeah, could you just give a quick rundown what we went over? I guess like some bullet points.
Sure. So I guess the first important thing is that front end must be served from the back end. In response to requests to /. So when we get a request to the home route, to the home page, instead of rendering a template, we're just going to send a static file, which is our React front end. So then React's going to create a build folder with all of your JavaScript and CSS inside of it. And we need to configure Django so that it'll serve those static files in response to requests, you know, in a script tag or link tag. So I use the API view, which is going to become relevant in just a second as I'm actually sending AJAX requests to sign up and log in. So that's roughly what we've done so far today. Yeah. I know there's a lot of concepts that go into these, so that's why I've been all the questions and a lot of code to look at. But these are the only problems we're trying to solve so far. Does that help?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay. What other questions do we have?
So because of the npm watch, we pretty much don't have to do npm run build anymore after we get that initial time.
Right, you'll never have to type that again, given that running npm watch does build it the first time.
Okay, and then npm watch, that's already comes in our JSON file. It's not something we created.
No, you have to add that there. So first I installed it with just npm install watch. But then once you've installed it, you can access it from your npm scripts. So given that I installed watch from my package JSON, I can write a script that uses it. So this is just a shell script that says watch. This is what we do. And this is when we do it.
Okay.
John?
So if we did have a reason where we needed to go jump back on the dev server for React, would we just set up a cores and test out that way, or is there a way to integrate what we're doing here into having a dev build as well?
You could set up cores. You would have to like set up some conditional logic so that like the cores is only used in development mode and not in production mode. But probably the more like proper answer that I should be giving you is that just create a React app by itself is not very flexible. Like the dev server only runs in dev mode. The built version is only in production mode. If you want to have like the flexibility to run, prod mode with the dev server or dev mode with built files, you would have to eject from the create React app, and then you can configure Webpack to work however you want it to.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, sorry, we're just kind of working within the limitations of create React app. It's not very configurable, but I figured that this is still easier than ejecting and then writing all this configuration ourselves. Any other, Nathan?
Yeah, so what's the benefit to serving your front end from the back end versus keeping your front and back completely separate?
Because it is one application, we can keep them all in the same folder, keep them all in the same Git repository. So we know that the versions match each other. We don't have to set cores headers. So we don't have to worry about any security vulnerabilities that could result from misconfigured cores headers. It's just generally like a simpler way to build an application, with the exception of the React dev server is not gonna like be as useful to you.
Well, I guess a better question on this would be is when we were on npm run build, we could specify the folder that it goes into. So we could specify the news project build or the news project as the target for the build, and still separate out the front end and the back end. That way on the front end, you could do whatever in isolation. In the back end, it still could be in isolation, but when you are running the build, it will, it'll still perform like you're doing here.
I'm not sure if I follow you.
So we would still have two separate ones. We'd have a folder for React front end and then a folder for the Django back end. But whenever we do our run build on line 25 there, we can specify the path to the back end as the target for where it's going to put all those files with the build and the static and everything. I mean, you still have a separation between the two.
Okay, I see what he's saying. So what if you had two different databases, a dev database and a production database, and these are shared together? How would you go in and swap to say, I need to do development and use your dev DB while you're running production builds?
So you'd have an environment variable for one thing.
Well, you have a dev environment variable and a production environment variable. Wouldn't this always be using your production environment variable?
So right now, this isn't looking at any environment variables. React just builds in production mode by default, regardless of the environment. But like I could set in my environment, env equals prod or env equals development or something like that. And then from the Django code in like the settings.py, so we could check here if the env is production or development, and then just connect to a different database depending on the environment.
Okay.
So that's how I would solve that problem.
Interesting. Thank you.
But so John, let me ask you, since it sounds like you know how to do this, how would I configure build to put the outputs into a different folder? Or one with the different
on your package JSON, you would just specify what folder it would have to go to after the run build. But that's contingent on, of course, it being in a different location than it is now.
Let me see. So let's just say I made a new folder called folder. So you're saying I can just name a folder here?
The same directory, it should. Of course, it's probably gonna blow up in my face now that I said that.
I think right now you're specifying the source, but if you had like a parent directory above the source, say like dev/source, then you could run it off that directory.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it put anything in this folder. I'm not sure if it uses this argument for anything.
Okay.
Well, if you scroll up in your terminal, I think it did built off of nothing because it's an empty folder. But it looks like it did build based on the build folder.
I mean, it doesn't build based on this. This should be the target, not the source. It should take everything that's in the SRC folder and then compile that and then just dump it in here. I expect that every time I run build, it is deleting the entire contents of the build folder and then replacing it with new stuff. And so it looks like nothing got placed here and got all put back in the build folder again. So that was kind of what I was expecting as I was tinkering around with this before. I found that there was basically no way to configure where React put these files after it built them. If someone can prove me wrong, I would love to hear about that. If you can configure that without ejecting from Create React App. But yeah, for sure, John, to your question, I would love if I could configure Create React App to dump these files somewhere else. And so if you can do that, there's probably an easier to read folder structure that you could build. So
I'm not an expert on it, but the difference between npm build and run build, what's the primary difference?
In this case, there isn't really any difference. So generally speaking, to run an npm script, you type npm run and then the script name. There are just a few scripts that are kind of privileged. They have special names, and so you can run them just without typing run.
Okay.
So for example, watch is not one of those. I just type npm watch. Wait, did that actually? Yeah, so that definitely did not do what I wanted it to do. It was running a watch command from, wait, hang on. Yeah, so that definitely did not work how I wanted it to work. I would have had to type npm run watch, and then that actually runs the watcher. Whereas like build is a privileged script. So I npm run build, like that works great. But if I'm just lazy, npm build. What? Okay, well, start is at least more privileged. So I guess build isn't special like that, but npm start works with or without run. So the short answer to your question is it doesn't really matter. For some special commands, you can omit run, but I usually just include it because I like typing. All right, get out of here. Does that help? Shouldn't have been too tricky. Saw a bunch of other hands up, I think. Courtney?
Hello. I'm feeling pretty confused. I think maybe because we haven't like seen React for a little bit, maybe it would be nice if we saw like the front end before you copied it over. And then I just want to clarify, like you just copied the files over and they kind of went into the right place, right? I did feel like you deleted something, but I don't remember what it was.
I deleted the empty folder where the front end used to be.
Okay, and did everything else just go where it was supposed to?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these things don't really need to be in a very particular place. All that matters is that Django knows that we have static files in build/static. So I set that in my settings.py for the news project. Where's that? So yeah, as long as Django knows that the static files come from build/static and that we can respond to requests for the home page by sending the index from build index.html. As long as those two things are in place, then Django is able to serve our React application. So what we're looking at here, this is the React front end. You know, it works same as it did before, except now the front end, this index.html, is being served by Django. What other questions do we have?
Raphael, I was wondering, this is really close to what Courtney asked, but like for us, when we would download a repo for the React News site, we would actually have two package lock JSONs and two package JSONs, like one in the parent folder and then one in the folder that would be created when you ran create React app, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but there's like two different sets. So can you show what yours looks like? Which one did you keep?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you should only have one package JSON. It should be at the top level of your project. So, you know, next to get ignored, manage.py, I've also got package JSON here. The top
okay,
level.
I'm not sure if it's just me, but I feel like everyone who pulled their repos has two. One inside the parent folder and then one inside the project folder. I don't know. I
think the one inside the project folder is the manifest JSON, something like that. I think that's what it's called. I don't think it's called package JSON.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if this might answer it, but when we give you React challenges, if it has a package.json in it, then you're going to want to do npm install from that, and that will install your node modules and everything on that level. If you're starting a project from scratch, we normally would not provide a package.json at that point. You would do create React app, which would have the package.json in it. So yeah, you should never have two package.jsons on different levels. That's likely not a correct project setup. But if you are seeing this, definitely let us know, and we could check out what you're doing with your project.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Rafael, I have a different question though. So okay. I'm just trying to like track exactly like what we did. So I know that we just moved our React project into the same, into a news project, right? That folder,
yep.
The top folder. And then after that we did, or actually before that, in the URLs, in our views, we made it serve the index HTML from React, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, okay, so we did that first, then we moved it. And then from there, we just ran npm run build.
I think before then I had changed the settings to set the static files directories.
Okay.
And then after that, yeah, I got building.
And then was that that's pretty much what we did?
Yep, that's basically where we're at.
Okay, and why did we change the settings again?
By default, Django serves static files from /static, but that's not where React is requesting them from. React is expecting the files to be in build/static. So we just have to update the static files DIRs on the Django side to match what React is expecting.
Okay, cool. So then and the build folder was created when we ran npm run build, right?
That's right.
Okay, so then after npm run build, then we changed the static file DIRs. Okay, cool. And then if we wanted any extra, like to serve a Django template, well, actually, I don't think we have to get into that. We'll just finish with this because that's just going to confuse me. But yeah, thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, you totally could serve a Django template. I'm not going to do that today, but there's nothing stopping you. I mean, I wouldn't serve a Django template here, but like other routes, not the home page. Sorry, I wouldn't serve a Django template here, but other routes might, like the sign up and login page could have been Django templates that were not part of the single page application.
But then how would you serve those? Would it just, Django just knows that, like, because you're doing responses, Django just know to check in templates?
I mean,
they would be viewing it from different parts, right? Django, it would be serving the Django templates from the templates folder and then serving React from static folder.
Yeah, I mean, I can still call render just the way I used to. I have to import it. I have to create a templates folder, but I can definitely have another route that's not related to my React application.
And then you can redirect to the React application from there. Okay, cool.
Yeah, just like redirect to / and that would get them to this page. What other questions do we have? All right, so let's take a break now. It's 11:20. Let's come back at 11:30, and then I'm gonna talk about authenticating into our full stack application.
Raphael, I put a list of the steps in the chat. I don't know if you can see and let me know if anything's off.
And it sounds like a pretty good list. I do want to mention though that like when I'm doing these things, like I don't think of it as a list of steps I have to take, but I think of it as like a problem or a series of problems that I need to solve. And so like, I just know that I need my backend to serve my front end. And so I'm gonna, fiddle around with the Django settings and debug until I achieve that. So like, you don't always know up front like what the exact steps you need to take are. But as long as you can figure it out, you can read the error messages and you know what success looks like. And when you're done, that's usually good enough. So I hope people don't get too fixated on just remembering all of the exact steps that I'm doing. But I want you to think more about, the problem that we're trying to solve and knowing what success looks like and how you can take one more step to get closer to where you want to be. All right. Do we have any other questions before we dive back in? Yes, definitely try it out. I certainly do not expect anyone's going to like learn this or memorize it just from watching me. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is authentication. We need to be able to log in to our news site so we can save some of our users' preferences. So, different people have different approaches to building a full stack feature. some people, start on the back end or they'll start on the front end, or they'll do the models or the views or whatever. That's not really how I think about things. Honestly, I haven't thought too hard about what my approach is to working on features. I just kind of write code and get things done. But people keep asking me about this, so I've had to like verbalize my approach over time. And I guess the way that I approach building features in a full stack application is, for whatever it is that you're trying to build, first, just assume that it already works. Then go try to use that feature. And then whatever the first thing is you notice that doesn't work the way you expect it should, build that and then try to use the feature again. So right now, what I want to do is I want to sign up for this website. So we've already got this sign up page. So I might have made that between the last news site and this one, while you weren't watching me. So that's in source pages. I've created the login and sign up pages already. And so the sign up page looks like it's got some kind of thick code here, but this is actually pretty simple. It's basically just there's a form, sign up form with the email and password. Whenever they type into it, we're handling the change so that we store that value in state. And then when they submit the sign up form, when they submit the sign up form, we just send the contents of the sign up form, which is just their email and password, to the server, and then log the response. Then that's it. Components, app nav. Wait a second. Something's not quite right here. This is the finished version of the application here. I think I might have messed up my Git settings a little bit here. At any rate, we're short on time, so maybe looking at the completed version of the application is best anyways. But so we've added in these nav links for sign up and log in. These are just rendering other pages. So I showed you those pages before. Just a moment ago, the login page. So this can send a post request to our server. This is handled at views/login. I've got this login route. This is actually just copy and pasted from a previous demo, from the authentication demo we did before, with just a couple of tiny changes. So I'm using the API view, saying that this is only for post requests. But then in order to actually access the user's data, their email and their password, I just have to access request.data. So this is one of the little favors that API view does for us. I no longer have to parse the body from JSON into a Python dictionary, but that's being done for me automatically by Django REST framework. And it's providing me a dictionary at request.data.
Does it assume it's a JSON because of the REST framework?
I believe so, yeah. 99% of the time, REST API is using JSON data. I'm sure there's a way you can configure it, but that's the default assumption, and it's generally correct. So I think I mentioned this before, but by default, the view handlers in Django are assuming it's getting a traditional browser request and it's returning HTML. So since, browsers can only submit forms with get or post, these kinds of API views are really only good for handling, or the traditional views are only good for handling GET or POST requests. Now, not really good for handling like put or delete requests. They're not going to parse the JSON automatically. So just in a few ways, the default settings for using this API view decorator are a little bit smarter, and just let us skip a few steps. But other than that, this should look pretty familiar to you. We're just getting the email and the password that was typed into the form. We authenticate the user. If that was successful, we do have a user and they are active. We log them in. And then there's some basic error handling here. But let's just see if that works. Account for Gates at self.com. Service Dragons. Got a 403 error, forbidden. What's the problem here? Hang on a second. Oh, okay. So the problem that we're having here is that I did not put the API view decorator on my signup route. So I need to add that. So another thing that this API view decorator does is it changes the default settings for the CSRF security. So here I got an error because I didn't include the CSRF token with my signup request. But like the whole point of the CSRF token is to prevent people exploiting a logged in user. So like it doesn't really make sense that you should need one when you're just signing up. So one of the things that using this API view does is it changes the default CSRF settings. So you only need that CSRF token when you're logged in. So let's try that again. We're going to sign up as all right, so we got a successful response. So that looks good. The server isn't set up so elegantly that it logs us in automatically. So I'm going to have to do that in a separate request here. I'm going to go to my login page, which was also, very familiar to the login page you've seen before. Something else hasn't been set up yet. Don't worry about the error. But so now that we're logged in, we can see that the front end UI changed. We got this new logout button in particular. So let's see how we set that up. So first of all, I want to show us how we're actually sending this AJAX request in the first place to log in. So I made this kind of utilities file that's just sort of odds and ends, various different JavaScript functions that don't really fit anywhere else. So now in order to log in, we're going to need to tell Django about our CSRF token, which it provides to us. So, after I logged in, where is it? Hang on a second. There should be some cookie headers here. Not sure I'm not seeing those. Okay, so here you can see when I log in, Django is setting this cookie called CSRF token. So I don't have to configure this at all. This is just a part of the automatic behavior of Django. When you log in, you get a CSRF token. But the kind of unusual thing about this token is that it's accessible in JavaScript. So the session ID token, that's supposed to be more secure. You cannot access that from document.cookie. But for the CSRF token, Django is actually expecting us to handle this using JavaScript. So this isn't just like my crazy harebrained scheme here. So this is a code from the Django documentation showing you how you can parse cookies from the cookie string. So, given document.cookie, can you find the Django CSRF token? So Django knows that this is something you're going to need to do on the front end. It's not something Django can do for you because it's JavaScript code, not Python code, but they provide this code to you because they're expecting you need to do this. And so this function here, get CSRF token, is pretty much the same as the function from the Django documentation. I chose to write it by hand for like no particular reason. So it's maybe not the same exactly character for character, but it's pretty similar. You're just looping through the cookie string, splitting it apart into the individual cookies, and then splitting those into the values of the cookies, just so you can get the token value. Okay, so this is just a helper function though, that lets us get that CSRF token from our cookie. But now the next thing we need to do is include this token in every request that we send to the server. So normally that would be kind of a headache. Just every time we write an API request, we would have to, set the headers on that API request to make sure that it has the CSRF token. Otherwise, we're going to get unauthenticated errors. But fortunately, Axios has some functionality that lets us do this automatically. So this is one of the reasons why I like using Axios over just fetch, because it has some of these advanced features that can be useful. So here I'm saying, I'm setting some default headers for Axios, that every request that goes out from Axios to my server needs to have this header, X CSRF token. This is something Django expects. I just got this from their documentation. And the value of that header is going to be get CSRF token. It's just the output from this function. So that way, every request that I send, where is it? Every request that I send back to the server automatically includes this X CSRF token. So this is what Django is looking for. And that's how Django knows that I am authenticated and that no one's trying to like hack my account or whatever. Previously we would have used that template tag for our like Django forms when we're using the templates. But since we're not using Django templates anymore, we have to do a little bit more manual effort in order to satisfy this CSRF requirement. But I feel better about this at least than just disabling CSRF using CSRF exempt. We did that, this past week just so you could focus on the actual content of the lecture without worrying about API security. But I feel like this is the time when we should actually be dealing with this instead of just building insecure applications. All right, so I guess long story short, for authentication from your React backend to your Django front end, most of it is the same from the previous lecture where we showed you the Django authentication. If we're looking just in, so yeah, most of the code in the sign up and login routes, this was just copy pasted from the last time that we covered Django authentication. Just Django REST framework makes it a little bit easier for us to access the body data using request.data instead of parsing it ourselves. But otherwise, the backend is pretty much exactly the same. I guess another difference is that when we log in, the backend cannot redirect the user because these are from AJAX requests, and you can't productively redirect an AJAX request. You can just tell the client if it was successful or failed, and then the client has to decide what to do. So like pages, login. So here, submit login form. After the user logs in, we're just redirecting them back to the home page, and then we refresh the page. So that just makes sure that any data fetching that runs when the page loads, we get that automatically after they log in. So we're using fresh data that's specific to their user. But the important thing here is that this logic had to happen on the client side, because since we're sending the login with an AJAX request, Django doesn't get the opportunity to redirect the user. Django just gets to say if it was successful or if it failed, and then the client decides what to do based on that. Still got our who am I route. This is not going to change at all. Log out. Again, just like log in, we can't redirect the user after they log out. We just tell the client that they've logged out. And so then on the front end, in our front end JavaScript, so I guess for logout, we're handling it a little bit different. For logout, instead of refreshing the page, we are requesting data from the server and then manually updating the state using who am I. So this is a function that takes the app state setter so that after it gets a response using Axios, it is able to set the app state given who the current user is. So that's how we're able to see in the nav bar, the logout button based on whether or not someone is logged in, because we are setting our app state to have this property user. And then in our app nav, don't worry about the preferences for right now, but in our app nav, we are conditionally rendering this logout button only if the user exists in app state. So we've got like a use effect on page load that has to fetch the user's data using Axios. We're setting that into state. And then if that was successful, if there is a user in our state, then we can view the logout button. Otherwise, if the user is not set, then this shouldn't be rendered because logging out a logged out user doesn't make any sense.
Raphael, I have a question. For that prop app state, where did it get that from? props.appstate.user, or just, yeah, where did those come from? Because since they're props, I'm guessing they came from another component. That's what I'm thinking, or I don't know where it came from.
So app_nav and app.js. So yeah, in the app.js, we have app state, set app state is use state. So, often we'll have a use state for just one variable, but I just don't have the time or patience for that. If you have like big forms with lots of fields or just lots of application state. So this is kind of a shortcut. I'm storing like an entire object with some nested properties all in one state variable, just called app state. And then on page load, we have this use effect that will call who am I, which gets access to set app state, so that this function is able to set the app state after we know who the current user is. But also, more to your question, in our app nav, the app nav gets the set app state function as well. So this app nav has full power to set the application state, the user or whatever. But more importantly than setting it is that it gets to view it. So that was the props, the app_nav props.appState and setAppState, those are getting passed in. So yeah, first we're checking appstate.user. If that exists, we can render the logout button. And then in order to log them out, we have to use setAppState to pass that to the logout method, because the logout method needs to know what it's doing after it logs them out. How do I define
so
that?
Log out, log in, who am I? Are those those aren't components, they're just functions?
Right. In my React application here, those are just functions. If I go back to, where's the app nav? So yeah, import logout from just utils.utils.js.
Okay.
It always happens that I'll have like a handful of functions that like aren't really the same as each other. So I wouldn't have like one folder with a good name to put them in, but they don't really belong at the top level. So I'll just make like a utilities folder for kind of odds and ends.
Okay, and is that just like a functions that you want to use, but they don't have like, they're not going to display anything? Or why do you have it? Like, why not just put it in, well, I guess because you're going to keep using it, right? So to keep your code dry.
Yeah. So for one, they're not components, so they don't render anything visual, but also I might use them from different places. So like there might be a variety of different reasons why I would call logout. Like for example, maybe if I think there's a bug in the authentication, like we just get some kind of illogical state regarding like their session, I might say like for error handling, like I don't know how we can recover from this. Let's just log the user out and have them log back in again. So I might need to call logout from a few different locations.
Okay, and would it also make sense to, like if you have an application that's making a lot of API calls, to have like that Axios API call function somewhere else, or do you have to call that in the component?
You do not have to call it in the component, and it certainly could make sense to have a separate file just for your API calls. So in this application in particular, I just don't have that many API calls and they're not super complicated. So I've just put them like directly in the functions where they're used. But in a much larger application, if you find that you have many API calls, it might be worth creating a dedicated folder just for all of these API calls. So I might have something that's just like a function that's just post/login. So in that case, I guess I would rewrite this like,
I know this might be dumb, but I actually think it's cool to see that you can just have a, not a component, but just like a JS folder with just a bunch of functions that don't display anything, but they still take props, it looks like.
I mean,
like
you can make any function.
Does login, yeah, does login.js have props for, I don't remember. Yeah, so it has props, but it doesn't render anything, right?
Right. I mean, it's not a component, or wait, hang on a second. Actually, no. So this is a component. Sorry, I thought it was in the utils folder for a second. Yeah. So this is for the login page.
Okay, so this is for the login page. Okay.
Sorry about
utils has no component, has no props though. The utils folder.
Right.
And you wouldn't be able to give it props?
I mean, I could if I want. Like these are just plain old JavaScript functions. These are not like hard connected to my React application, but I could certainly define some function and just, why not say that it's props, but this isn't like really connected to a React component or whatever. I would have to call this and then pass props in manually so it's able to work with them.
Okay, I see.
So yeah, it's just the name that I chose. You can call them whatever.
Real quick, I think this is kind of along the lines of like what Edgar was just asking about. But if you go back to your utils.js, so when you log out and you set app state, you're not actually like passing in any arguments in the set app states in the set app state. Sorry, it's down a little bit, like the middle of the page, right there, 29. So you're not actually passing in any arguments to set app state. So does that just like default to an empty object then?
So I'm not calling set app state here. I'm just passing it through so that when whoami gets called, it has access to the function. So whoami is going to call it. So right below here in the definition of whoami, it gets this setter function passed in. And so then it just calls it later on because whoami is going to get the data about the user. And in theory, like whoami could return the data, but the very next thing I would want to do is just set that data in the app state. So I figure since that's always the thing I'm going to want to do next, I would just put that in the whoami function itself. But since whoami is defined in utils, which is not where set app state was defined, I had to just pass it in as an argument.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I completely overlooked the whoami function when I was looking at that. That's why I got confused.
Yep, and it's a little weird too. You know, we're doing some functional programming here, passing in a function as an input parameter that gets called by another function. But in this case, I think it enables, you know, better code separation, better code cleanliness. What other questions do we have? Andrew?
I got a little lost earlier with the CSRF token. So let me try to explain it and see if like I can. So when we send in like a login request or sign up request requires a CSRF token, it gives us a CSRF token automatically, but it's given to us in JavaScript, right? And then we need that. Then we need that token within Django. So that like, then you like copy the function. It's like 15 lines of code that it just like takes that CSRF token from JavaScript, takes it to Python so Django can use it, right?
Pretty much. So just to clarify though, for sign up and log in, you should not need a CSRF token for those requests. Yeah. So for sign up and login, you should not need a CSRF token for those requests because those are intended for unauthenticated users. And the way you get the CSRF token is by being logged in. At least with this current workflow using Django REST framework and the API views, you don't get the CSRF token until you're logged in. But so the way that the CSRF token normally works is that there would be a set cookie header from the response saying like, hey, this is your CSRF token, which also means that in the requests, my browser is automatically sending the CSRF token automatically as a cookie. However, Django will not respect the CSRF token when it's sent as a cookie because this gets sent automatically. So from Django's perspective, it's like, yeah, I see you sent the CSRF token in a cookie, but that gets sent automatically. Like that could have been someone hacking you and tricking you into sending me that CSRF token. Like I want you to send that in a different way that proves that like you did some manual JavaScript on your front end to send me that token. So that's why our AJAX requests are going to include the CSRF token as a header. So again, it also has the CSRF token in a cookie because my browser just does this automatically. But for Django's perspective, this is not secure enough because this token got sent automatically. It's like thinking I might have gotten hacked. It doesn't really trust it. But when if I have the same CSRF token, NZOIG, if I have the same CSRF token in this specific header, Django trusts that and says like, oh, okay, you probably weren't hacked. It looks like this was a deliberate request from a real user. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Cool. What other questions do we have? No other questions. All right. So for tonight, so I'm gonna stop sharing.